I'm under an understanding that that pop culture, movies, mass media, magazines, early radio, to me, London man, it's all been instituted as propaganda. I don't see a time in history where entertainment and mass media entertainment was anything other than propaganda. Like, I don't think at some point entertainment was taken over as propaganda. I think they instituted it as propaganda from the beginning. And I want to start showing people examples of that. Again, I want to start highlighting early propaganda, because we say, a lot of us in these communities, we'll talk about what the programming, the indoctrination, the conditioning, and otherwise. But I want to start showing examples of it, because we should have receipts, right, London man? I mean, if we say things, we should show it. So what I want to do is I want to start showing examples of early propaganda. And what better propaganda to show than space propaganda? Because I want to make some points to people. All right. So what I want to present today, London man, is there was a magazine that came out in the 1920s called Amazing Stories. You guys can look it up. It's all in the public domain now. These images are public domain at this point. This was one of the earliest science fiction magazines that was ever produced. And they would do, monthly periodic issues. And they would present these stories, these images, and otherwise. And it's called Amazing Stories. And I want to show you guys how mass media on all levels has been used as propaganda from the very beginning. And I want to use this magazine, Amazing Stories, to highlight that. So this was one of their early issues, okay? You can see it's dated April 1926. The first thing I want to show to you is, what's the first thing that, I think this might have been their first issue. What did they put on the very first issue of this magazine? Saturn, right?
Yep.
They had to show us Saturn with the rings, with everything. So that means something to me, because many of us know how Saturn plays into the astrology of the elite. How many of their secret societies, their ancient religions, their mystery schools, many of them revolved around Saturn and Saturn worship. So I do think it's relevant to note that they pointed out Saturn right away in their first issue. All right, let's move on. Here's another one, dude. In the 1920s, they're showing us examples of rocket technology, right? But let me ask you this, London. How did they know? How did this random science fiction artist know? How could they even conceptualize what a rocket would look like when, at the time of this publication, we were still in the early stages of flight? The Wright brothers had barely had their first flight. World War I had happened. There was just basic flight technology. There certainly wasn't rocket technology. But look what they're displaying us here in the mid-1920s, man. This looks like the rockets you see today. This looks like the Elon Musk, his Falcon 9 rocket that you see. But how did this random magazine, it was just trying to make a buck, apparently, selling a magazine, how are they aware of what the design, the engineering, what the aerodynamics should be of rocket technology? How did they know it's so early? It begs the question. But says, if you look when the first rocket engineering was being produced by JPL, Jet Propulsion's Laboratory, which is the precursor to NASA, if you looked at the time period when they were developing this technology, which was in the 1940s, but here we are, 20 years before the first supposed rocket, you see examples of basically a rocket ship in space being presented to the public. All right, so here's another one. I want to point this out to you, right? So again, we're looking at a magazine cover from the 1920s, but I want you to look at the imagery. First off, let's look in the background. It appears that they're on it appears that they're on the moon, right? There's Earth in the background. All right, that's the globe Earth, because I can see the Americas, right? I can see the polar ice cap on top, which is funny because now they say we don't have a polar ice cap. But here's my question, London man. This is the 1920s, all right? Now, this is before the first purported satellite was put up. The first satellite was apparently by the former USSR. In 1957, apparently they put up what they called Sputnik. So that means we didn't even have a concept of so-called space until 1957. But here we are with an image 30 years prior to the first satellite in space of a globe Earth from the moon. At this point, the globe was only theory, speculation. The globe was not proven in the 1920s. They tell us that the globe wasn't proven until the first moon mission, where once the astronauts were far enough away from Earth, about 250,000 miles, they were able to look back and see Earth. But why are they showing us a perfect globe from the moon in the 1920s? All right. And then secondly, this other image that they have here, it almost looks like a machine, this highly technological sphere that they have. It almost looks like a cage to me. Here's another one, Jupiter, right? Very likely they're trying to depict this as one of the moons of Jupiter. They tell us that the moon of Titan, one of the moons of Jupiter, is basically inhabitable. They has, an atmosphere, water. Now, here they are in the 1920s showing us basically a technological human civilization on one of these moons of Jupiter. Okay, you could see the other moons around it. You could see Jupiter depicted with the classic storm, that eye that they have. And you see the people there living. They're on a shore line. There's water. It's inhabitable. They look happy. They look joyous. They're getting out of their spacecraft, almost as if they've arrived at their destination, their new home, on this moon of Jupiter. But again, let's really think about the time. This was before they had supposed, satellites in space, before Pioneer, Voyager, these probes that they sent out into deep space. But here they're going to tell you in the 1920s that there's an inhabitable moon of Jupiter that in some way we're going to colonize. And again, look at the rocket technology that they're depicting here in the 1920s. See, this is fascinating. I guess my point is this. Why was the science fiction imagery predicting the future of actual science? Why were the stories that they were telling us predating the science themselves? And what does that really mean about this technology that they're presenting to us? Did the technology already exist and they rolled it out on us? Is there something they knew that they were occulting and hiding from us? So again, this is from the 1920s or early 30s. They're showing you men on the moon, right? Again, I want to impress this to people. You have to understand the timing. This is 30 years before the first supposed satellite in space. This is 20 years before the development of rocket technology. And this is 40 years before the first supposed manned moon mission. But here they are showing you men on the moon with obviously Earth in the background. But I also find this very interesting is notice the spacesuits that they have them in. To me, the spacesuits that they have them in are actually more realistic than the current presentation of the astronaut spacesuits. They have them in metallic suits because in reality, if space were real and it were actually basically a vacuum, the vacuum of space, where there's basically no particles, no particles of air, you would have to have a metallic suit. You would have to have a hard shell suit that would be able to withstand the high pressure negative vacuum of the environment of space. So even in the 1920s, as they were predicting fake space, they had enough sense to realize that the suit would have to be able to withstand that environment. But what did they do in the 1960s when they had to fake it? They probably realistically couldn't put guys in metal suits because the logistics of it probably proved to be too difficult. So they put them in the goofy space suits that we are accustomed with. But here in the 1920s, as they were preparing to indoctrinate you with a space-based presentation, they at least knew enough to give them hard metallic suits, steel or otherwise. But again, two things. One, the globe wasn't proven, quote unquote, in the 1920s. So why are they showing you a globe? And two, they're showing you men on the moon 40 years before we even had an idea that men can be on the moon. Here's another one, right? Again, men in space. Notice how they've altered the spacesuit to be a little bit more like the spacesuits that we saw presented in the late 60s and early 70s with the so-called astronauts. The helmet's a little bit more like the astronauts you would see. And this is a later issue. I think this one is from the 1930s. So it's almost as though as time progressed, they started to alter their programming to more closely approximate what they were going to present to us as, actual, real life space exploration. So again, you see these guys in space. But I just wanted to note that the alteration in the actual spacesuits. Here's another one I thought was interesting. More space-based presentation in the 1930s. I thought the hexagonal shape that they're showing us here is of note for whatever reason. And again, I'm wondering with these if they're trying to show us another conception of a spacesuit, or if they're showing us maybe like some type of machine-like android technology being used. Because you see the astronaut encased in this this hexagonal sphere. Almost you would call this maybe a geodesic sphere-like technology, like a honeycomb sphere.
Yep.
But you see the space. Yeah, exactly. But you see the spaceman on the inside, but this time he's operating like humanoid-like drones outside. So now it's like they took the space-based technology, but they now included it and expanded it into like AI, humanoid drone presentation. But again, guys, this is all in the 1930s. This is before computers. This is before the technology that we have today. So, that's what I'm trying to show people is like, why were they showing us the technology that we would eventually see? Why were they showing us in science fiction? And then there's another thing I wanted to point out, London Man, is it's not only an indication of some type of let's say, engineering, some type of overarching, greater societal engineering. But to me, it shows us a collusion between different entities of the control structure, because they want to give us a reality and paint a reality in which you have governmental agencies that are separate from each other, that you have private agencies, private corporations, private entities that are separate from these governmental agencies. So they're trying to present you like, oh, we have this Amazing Stories magazines where it's owned by somebody and they hire these artists and they're just trying to produce basically, a magazine that's has entertainment and information and otherwise. But what I see is evidence of collusion. I see evidence of propaganda from the top down, and it begs the question: was this early Amazing Stories magazine just a couple of guys that were, let's say, intelligent, innovative, and creative? Or are we seeing a propaganda rolled out straight from the top, from a Ministry of Information, meant to propagandize and control the population of the world? And I find, London Man, that it's the magnitude of the control is what's difficult for people to comprehend, because through the average understanding of the everyday person who has a particular paradigm, a particular worldview, within those narrow bookends, one typically cannot understand the magnitude of such a deception. They can't conceptualize how such a huge organized lie could be perpetrated amongst mankind. So with that limited understanding, they reject all the evidence that proves that we seem to be living in a control matrix thought prison paradigm from the top down. They can't conceptualize such a huge control matrix, so they just reject it. And they'll give comments like I'm seeing in the chat from some people who just want to basically dismiss the evidence that I'm showing and that you and I are talking about. And they just want to say, oh, it's just a bunch of creative people that have imaginations. Oh, it's just some authors that were really involved with some of the emerging, science of the day. So they're able to do this. People will go through high levels of mental gymnastics. They'll evidence cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and all these other types of intellectual, emotional, and cognitive defense mechanisms in order to protect their paradigm. They're unwilling to look at the evidence on its face because it challenges their paradigm and thus their identity. And that's the level of control. It's a mind control. It's a consciousness control. And we imprison ourselves with our own consciousness. They're doing it to us, but we're the ones that are enslaving ourselves. We're making a choice to do so. The level of cognitive dissonance on some people, the cog dis with some people is amazing, because they'll try to justify this. They'll say, yeah, we just were really smart and we knew we can travel in space, and then we just did it 40 years later. We just happened to know that we could do it, and we did it. How would you know what's up there until you got up there? How could you even have a concept of a spaceship literally 30 years before we even had the technology apparently to blast something that high and reach 0G environment? How would you even know what that is up there until you went there? And some people, they'll never get it, London Man. They can't see something that's so obvious, to me at least. And that's the level of the indoctrination. It's amazing to me. You know, and here's another one again. More people in space. Again, here's another one. Rocket technology. This one looks like it's blasting through the firmament. Like look how it's like blasting through, almost like it's coming through like a hard structure. They're depicting laser technology, high advanced
Yeah.
technology. Dude,
Mhm.
I want people to think what it was like in the late 20s and early 30s when they were depicting these things. Look what a car looked like. Model T cars. People didn't even have televisions. Do you understand what I'm trying to say, dude? This is in the 1930s, man.
Mm.
Movies were just starting to have sound. They were flicker movies.
Mm.
They barely had sound. I want people to understand the level of technology they were predicting at the time. And then all of a sudden, it turns out that now we have lasers, now we have computers, now we supposedly have people in space developing colonies and an international space station. Why were they predicting science in science fiction? I want people to, that's what I'm trying to impart to people. But people still won't see it, London, man. They're going to look at it through their eyes of indoctrination. They're going to look at it through their paradigm. Why did
Mhm.
science fiction turn out to be science fact? What is this
Mm.
technology? How are they on the in? It's incredibly. This is entitled Space Hounds of IPC. You
Mhm.
wouldn't know what space is in 1930s. You wouldn't even have a concept of it other than theory and conjecture.